My husband suddenly insisted that we start attending church every weekend. When I found out the real reason why, I filed for divorce. Rebecca's hand remained completely steady as she held out her phone. Mine wasn't. The coffee station behind us was making that soft, gurgling sound. And the fellowship hall smelled like burnt decaf and lemon bars, and every single cell in my body was screaming at me to take the phone, look at the screen, and let the last 10 years of my life collapse in real time. I took it. The first screenshot was a text thread, Brian's name at the top, hundreds, maybe thousands of messages going back years. I scrolled up, scrolled further, kept scrolling until I reached a message dated March 2019. We had been married for 3 years by then. I read it twice. Then I looked up at Rebecca, this woman I had met 60 seconds ago, this woman whose name I hadn't even known until this morning. How long? I said. She didn't hesitate. Since he found me on Facebook in 2017, I had to grab the edge of the table to keep from sitting down on the floor. Let me back up. Because if you told me 18 months ago that my life would come apart in a church fellowship hall on a Sunday morning, I would have said you had the wrong family. We weren't perfect. Nobody is. But we were solid. 10 years of marriage. A 7-year-old daughter named Kiara who still slept with a stuffed walrus named Gerald. A house in a suburb outside Columbus with a rose bush that I over-pruned every spring and a garage that perpetually smelled like motor oil, no matter what we did about it. Brian was a structural engineer with a firm downtown that he genuinely liked. I'm a physical therapist at a rehab clinic. I work mostly with post-surgical patients, people rebuilding movement from scratch, functional, professional people with a mortgage and a Costco membership, and absolutely no drama. We had our ordinary troubles, the kind that every couple accumulates over a decade like sediment. The year he worked so much we felt like roommates. The stretch after Kiara was born, when we forgot how to be a couple before we figured out how to be parents. The disagreement about his mother's Christmas visits that we never fully resolved so much as mutually stopped discussing. Real textured marriage struggles, nothing that didn't feel navigable. Brian was also famously constitutionally opposed to organized religion. He had called it a pyramid scheme with better music at my cousin's confirmation party, loudly, within earshot of her very Catholic parents. And I had spent the drive home alternately laughing and wanting to climb out the window. It was very Brian. He had opinions and he did not feel the social need to contain them, which was charming in small doses and occasionally catastrophic in large ones. Faith just wasn't in his wiring. His parents were secular, he was secular. And the only time he'd been inside a church in the decade I'd known him was our wedding, where he'd worn a suit that cost too much and cried at my vows in a way I felt physically in my chest. In a way I still think about, that was who I married. That was who I understood myself to have built a life with. So when Brian sat me down one evening in February and told me he wanted us to start attending Sycamore Ridge Community Church every Sunday as a family, non-negotiable, I laughed out loud for longer than was probably kind. He didn't laugh. I'm serious, Julie. I need it, the community, the peace. I looked at him the way you look at someone when a sentence doesn't parse. His posture was wrong, too deliberate. Like he'd been rehearsing this conversation in the car, in the shower, in whatever private mental space he'd carved out that I apparently didn't have access to. His hands were flat on the table, which is what Brian does when he wants to appear calm, not when he is calm. Brian, you literally said grace ironically at Thanksgiving in front of my grandmother. People change, they do, I know that. I'm a healthcare professional. I understand the research on meaning and spiritual seeking, especially during periods of stress or existential drift. Brian had been dealing with some work pressure that winter. A major project was consistently behind schedule, longer hours. He'd started taking longer with his coffee in the mornings, lingering in the kitchen in a way that felt less like enjoying breakfast and more like postponing what came next. It wasn't a huge red flag. It was a tired husband in his early 40s navigating a difficult quarter. I'd seen it before in different forms. I'd waited it out before. I didn't want to be the wife who shuts down a healthy coping mechanism, so I said yes, and I want to be clear about this. I meant it. I wasn't humoring him. I genuinely thought for at least the first several weeks that Brian was doing something good for himself, and that my discomfort with the reversal was my problem to manage. Not a signal I needed to follow. That's important for what comes later. I wasn't ignoring signs because I was checked out. I was extending grace because I loved him and believed in the version of him I knew. That's the thing about good performers, they know how to spend your trust like it's currency. Sycamore Ridge was a mid-sized evangelical church, welcoming without feeling overwhelming. It had contemporary worship music, a relaxed dress code, and a pastor named Glenn who somehow made sports metaphors fit every sermon. I had grown up loosely Methodist, so church wasn't unfamiliar to me. Kiara loved the children's wing, their crafts were always wonderful, and Brian seemed to know exactly where to sit, which ushers to greet, and when to smile during the sermon. He even closed his eyes during prayer, calm and motionless, like someone who had attended church his entire life. It felt a little unusual, but I convinced myself it was harmless. People find community, they settle in. Maybe he'd been watching YouTube sermons during lunch, trying to catch up and fit in. That sounded like Brian, the man who once spent an entire month learning enough Italian just to order dinner confidently in Rome. When he committed to something, he gave it everything. It was one of the reasons I'd fallen in love with him. I noticed it, tucked it away, and moved on. The first Sunday I felt something was wrong, it wasn't in my mind, it was in my gut. About 5 weeks in, we were greeting people during that part of the service when everyone stands, shakes hands, and chats for a few minutes. Brian excused himself to use the bathroom. Nothing unusual, he left, came back, sat down, and finished the service. But during the drive home, he was unusually quiet, not peaceful quiet, contained quiet. The kind of silence that feels like someone is trying not to let something spill over. I noticed that too. He's an introvert, I reminded myself. Maybe the crowd had simply drained him. Week 7 changed everything. Again, Brian said he needed to use the bathroom. 10 minutes passed. I checked my phone, called him, and got no answer. I sent a text. The typing bubbles appeared. Then disappeared, no reply. My stomach twisted the same way it had the night my father was rushed to the hospital, that instinctive fear that exists before words. I left Kiara with Margaret, a kind grandmotherly woman from the congregation I'd spoken with before, then headed back inside. The men's restroom was near the entrance. I knocked, no answer. I pushed the door open slightly. Empty. I checked the sanctuary, only a few people remained, no Brian. Then I walked down the hallway past the church offices toward the back of the building and stopped. At the end of the corridor, a window stood slightly open. Outside, the garden glowed in the late morning sun, honeysuckle climbing the fence, and there was my husband, standing only a few feet away from a woman I'd never seen before. She was tall, blonde, wearing pearls, her arms crossed tightly with the unmistakable posture of someone who didn't want to be there. Brian was talking urgently, stepping closer than I was comfortable with, his hands moving as if time were running out. I stayed perfectly still. The window was open just enough. "Do you understand what I did?" he said, his voice low and desperate. It was the same voice he'd used the night Kiara was born, when he held her and whispered, "I didn't know it could feel like this. I brought my whole family here just so you could see. We could have had it all, a real life, kids, everything you always wanted. I'm ready now, I'll do anything." The woman simply stared at him. She didn't look angry, she looked exhausted. Like someone forced to repeat the same conversation far too many times. "I feel sorry for your wife," she said softly, "and your daughter." Brian opened his mouth to respond. She raised one hand, firm and final. "We are never getting back together. Stop contacting me. This obsession you've had since high school isn't love, it's stalker-level creepy. If you ever reach out again, I'll file for a restraining order." Then she turned and walked away without looking back. Brian remained standing in the garden, shoulders slumped, staring at the ground as if watching his fantasy disappear. I backed away from the window. Somehow I made it to the car. I don't remember the walk. 2 minutes later, Brian climbed into the passenger seat, kissed Kiara on the forehead, and smiled at me as though nothing had happened. As though he hadn't just begged another woman to destroy our marriage in a church garden. "Sorry I took so long," he said. "Long line for the bathroom." "Of course," I replied with a smile. My hands shook the entire drive home. I'm not someone who cries when I'm in shock, I clean. By midnight, I'd scrubbed both bathrooms, reorganized the pantry, and disinfected every shelf in the refrigerator with the mechanical focus of someone trying to keep her mind too busy to break apart. I told myself I'd misunderstood. Maybe I'd taken the conversation out of context. Maybe she was an old friend. Maybe there was an explanation. I've always been good at giving people the benefit of the doubt. My therapist, doctor. Angela Morris once told me that my ability to extend grace to people who hadn't earned it was both my greatest strength and my greatest weakness. She was right, so I gave it one more week. The following Sunday, everything looked normal. We dressed for church, drove there together, Brian sang along with the radio, laughed at one of Kiara's jokes, and even held the door open for me with the same little bow I'd loved for years. Same church, same row, same greetings, same closed eyes during prayer. When the service ended, he smiled at me. "Wait here," he said, "bathroom." I waited exactly 3 seconds. Then I walked back inside and headed straight toward the woman from the garden. She stood near the coffee station, slowly stirring her drink, staring into space with the expression of someone who had learned how to disappear in a crowded room. The moment she saw me, her face changed, not surprise, recognition. She already knew exactly who I was. "I'm Brian's wife," I said quietly. "I think you and I need to talk." She gently set her cup down. Her name was Rebecca Hall. She worked as a dental hygienist and had grown up in the same small rural Ohio town where Brian was raised. They had dated briefly in high school before Rebecca moved away. Years later, Brian found her on Facebook, and what started as harmless messages slowly turned into an unhealthy obsession. Even after she blocked him on every platform, he kept finding ways to contact her, even locating her home and eventually joining her church. Rebecca reported him to the police, but without direct threats, little could be done. When she finally showed me years of messages, I realized Brian had been living a double life throughout our marriage. He had shared photos of our daughter with Rebecca and described the life he wished he had with her. Instead of confronting him immediately, I documented everything, contacted my sister Dana, a family lawyer, and worked with my therapist and a forensic psychologist. The evidence revealed years of stalking, surveillance, and obsessive behavior. Rebecca, with legal help, filed for a restraining order using years of documented evidence. The court granted a 5-year no-contact order. Soon after, I filed for divorce. Brian moved out peacefully, and we arranged custody of our daughter. Recovery wasn't easy, but with therapy and support, I slowly rebuilt my life. Rebecca was finally safe, my daughter adjusted well, and I learned that some people can hide an entirely different reality behind a normal life. Looking back, I don't blame myself for missing the signs. When the truth became clear, I acted calmly, carefully, and protected the people who mattered most.